I, the UAE, will give you, the Israelis, the ability to have a military presence on the Red Sea. The gamble that Asim Munir has taken in putting Islamabad as the mediator may well be a poison chalice that could put him in serious trouble if the Americans and the Iranians don't find a deal. But they are struggling to navigate between the headline that Trump wants, in which details are absent, and the details that Iran wants, in which the headline is absent for Donald Trump. Umar al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala responds and he says that this is not a good method of governing, having two leaders. And if we should choose, then it is better that we choose somebody from Quraysh. The Gulf leaders prefer that not only will I not follow one leader, but if any of you, my brothers, try to be the leader, wallahi, I'll bring the American bullets against you. I think to Kardashian, I'm not going to comment on the username of choice, and to Faisalabad, I think if we start with the ceasefire itself, I think the reality is that even Trump doesn't know what he wants. Trump doesn't know the details of what he wants. Trump only knows the outcome or the reaction that he wants from the American public when all of this is finished. And that reaction is a very simple one. Trump wants everybody to come out and say that, oh, great president, we're so sorry that we doubted you. Now we understand what all of this is for. Trump wants to waive a deal in which he goes to the American people and says to them, look at the deal that I made. I got a deal that Obama couldn't negotiate, that people before me couldn't negotiate. And the reason I got these terms from the Iranians is because of decisions that I took, the decisions that you doubted, the decisions that you said were clumsy, that I had no strategy for. This is what I always knew. And he wants the American public, he wants the American media to turn around and say, when all is said and done, the president managed to achieve something. Donald Trump doesn't know what he wants in terms of details, but he wants to be able to parade something to the American people whereby they turn around and they say, oh, Lebanon normalized with Israel. First time they opened talks in 30 years. And Trump wants to say, you see, this is because of what I did. This is because of me attacking the Iranians. This is because I did something that you guys did not understand. I'm a different kind of president. And he wants his followers to turn around and say, Mr. President, we're sorry that we doubted you. And this complex that Trump has is reflected in the fact that he even depicted himself almost as Jesus Christ, where he posted an image on social media where it's as if, he's depicting himself as like Jesus Christ himself, coming down and healing the nations and fixing the world. He sees himself in that light. This is problematic for the Iranians, who don't necessarily care about the headline as much as they care about the details. The Iranians want a lifting of sanctions. They need money to rebuild what's been destroyed. The Iranians want details in terms of an assurance that the US will not attack it again. They want an assurance that Iran will be able to access $20 billion in frozen funds. The Iranians care about the details. And that's where the problem for Pakistan comes in. This is the problem in that Pakistan wants a deal so it can celebrate its status as a new mediator. And Asim Munir in particular needs this to succeed because given that he has no legitimacy in the ballot box, given he has no legitimacy to rule the country from a democratic mandate, he wants to use this mandate of let's get behind the nation, I'm making Pakistan a better place, forget about Imran Khan, I am the ruler of Pakistan and my legitimacy comes from my ability to solve Pakistan's problems and elevate it on the international stage. The problem for Pakistan is this: Pakistan wants the deal to be signed, but they are struggling to navigate between the headline that Trump wants, in which details are absent, and the details that Iran wants, in which the headline is absent for Donald Trump. How do you bring these two together? Moreover, how do you get the Iranians to sit with the Americans when they don't want to sit with Kushner and Witkoff? Kushner and Witkoff were described by a British official as representing more the Israeli interest than they did the American interest. They were almost described as Israeli assets by some of the British diplomats. The Iranians want to sit with somebody like J.D. Vance or the like, so that they can be assured that they're not negotiating with the Israelis, rather they are negotiating with the Americans, because the Americans can keep the Israelis in check and it prevents the Israelis from squandering and scuppering these ceasefire talks. Which is why Trump said J.D. Vance wasn't going to go to the talks because of some security issue. Then he came out and said Vance is going to the talks. And now at the time of this recording, which is on the Monday, we're not sure exactly whether the talks are going to take place in Islamabad or not, given that there's been a flaring of tensions in that the Iranians lifted the blockade on the Hormuz Strait after the ceasefire in Lebanon, but then they were expecting Trump to lift his blockade on the blockade in the Hormuz Strait, and Trump refused to lift that blockade. So the Iranians are saying this is bad faith. Iranians are saying we can't negotiate with you like that. And Asim Munir flew to Tehran urgently, went and sat with the Iranians, and it seems that they've said to him that, Asim, you need to go back to the Americans and tell them that we will not negotiate unless the Americans withdraw that blockade. And Donald Trump tweeted and said that, I'm now considering it, I'll see where it goes. I've heard the message from Asim Munir, I heard the message from the Iranians, let's see where it goes. I think that for Pakistan itself, where does Islamabad sit in this? I think Islamabad sits in a very awkward position in that the original intention was how to make Islamabad a global center whereby it can elevate itself to sit with the major players as a major power in the region. The problem, however, is that these negotiations are proving harder than Asim Munir anticipated. The reason I'm focusing on Asim Munir here is because this is Asim Munir's gambit. If you notice, he's the one always being mentioned in the tweets. He's in a way that's quite unusual for state diplomacy. If you think about it, Donald Trump, when he speaks with Macron about military affairs in the region, he doesn't say, I thank Macron and the chief of staff in a tweet. When he speaks with Keir Starmer, he doesn't say, I had a wonderful discussion with Keir Starmer and the UK chief of staff. When he speaks with China, he doesn't say, I sat with Xi Jinping or I spoke with Xi Jinping and the chief of staff. It only seems to be a Pakistani thing whereby the army chief of staff is mentioned in a superior context to that of the supposedly elected prime minister. This is Asim Munir's gambit. Asim Munir needs these talks to succeed, to continue elevating his status, in that given that he's spent a lot of time trying to win over the Americans, so that they might cement his authority in Pakistan after the whole fiasco that took place with Imran Khan and preventing elections in Punjab after PTI won the landslide election, after putting him in prison and throwing 200 charges at him and trying to find a way to make him go away, and then the fiasco that took place in the elections that took place whereby the rigging wasn't necessarily as effective as it should have been, and some independent PTI candidates almost beat even Maryam Nawaz and these others. Asim Munir wants to be on the good side of the Americans, one, to leverage them against the Indians, and also to affirm his own rule as the ruler of Pakistan. The problem, however, is, and what's coming up, is this defense pact security agreement that he has with Saudi Arabia. Because the Saudis are unsure what's the best way to approach Iran. Should they be supporting the talks between Trump and the Iranians? Or should they be preparing for war again, a renewed conflict? A conflict that the Israelis and the Americans want the Saudis to fight. A conflict whereby the UAE wants to make sure that Iran doesn't come out of it a tiger, that Iran doesn't come out of it as a country that can continue to exert pressure on the Hormuz Strait and essentially hold the UAE economy to ransom. The problem with the security pact now that Asim Munir is finding, that he negotiated outside of the mandate of an elected government. So they topple Imran Khan, there's a caretaker government. Usually it shouldn't have the right to negotiate a security agreement, but in Pakistan it doesn't seem to matter. Asim Munir goes and negotiates this security pact with the Saudis. I think the intention of the security agreement was that Pakistan would never really be called upon to fight on behalf of the Saudis. It would be maybe a technology exchange. And in return, Pakistan would get money from Saudi Arabia. And Asim Munir would use that money in order to try to find some sort of short economic fixes by which he can appease the Pakistani people in order to prevent them from continuing to challenge an unelected authority. The problem is that now the Saudis seem to be invoking that defense treaty, saying that there is a possibility that war with Iran might come about again, and the Americans have failed to protect Saudi infrastructure. So the Saudis are effectively saying, we might consider that the Pakistanis do the fighting for us, not the Saudis. The Qataris are also interested in this, that not the Qataris do the fighting. The Pakistanis do the fighting on behalf of the Qataris and the Saudis. And that's deeply problematic for Pakistan, which has a very long border with Iran. That's deeply problematic for Pakistan, which is not interested in fighting the Iranians. It's not interested in getting into a conflict with the Iranians. And it knows how difficult it is to fight the Iranians. And the Pakistani economy is not in a position whereby it can go to war, even if it is for $8 billion that the Saudis are reportedly offering them. The UAE, which was angry at Islamabad for facilitating the talks because it wanted war, lashed out and demanded the return of its loan. Some are saying it's because the UAE need the money. Maybe, maybe not. But regardless, as soon as UAE withdrew that money, the Saudis and the Qataris stepped in to give that money to Pakistan. Almost as if to say to the Pakistanis that, listen, we still want you to do as we ask and We are expecting the support. The problem for Islamabad now is it may well go from being a mediator to being an active player, or being asked to be an active player by not only the Saudis but also by the Americans. If you imagine the lobbying that might be taking place between the UAE and the Americans, UAE and the Americans, and perhaps even Saudi and the Americans, may be discussing and saying, Mr. Trump, in the event that you choose to go back to war, there is a possibility we can use the Pakistani army. There's a possibility we can use Pakistan as a means by which to apply greater pressure on the Iranians. If Asim Munir is asked by Donald Trump to intervene and start applying pressure on the Iranians, does he do so? If he doesn't do so, do Saudi and Qatar withdraw that funding and plunge his country into a renewed economic crisis? How far is Asim Munir willing to go in order to preserve a position that lacks a mandate? And to what extent will he choose the interests of the security and stability of Pakistan over the preservation of his own position? In other words, the gamble that Asim Munir has taken in putting Islamabad as the mediator may well be a poison chalice that could put him in serious trouble if the Americans and the Iranians don't find a deal. Faisal Abad, when you ask how do we preserve a tactical alliance with Iran while condemning the documented war crimes, I would change the framing from tactical alliance. I think that if you look at this war as if you're backing a team, then the lens is clouded and you see this as you support one side unconditionally. There is an Arab saying, لِكُلِّ حَادِثٍ حَدِيث, to every event its own dynamics. Iran committed horrific massacres in Syria. Iran committed horrific demographic changes in Iraq. Iran did support the coup in Yemen, the Houthis who toppled a government that was brought about by national dialogue. The Houthis were concerned that the way the trajectory was going in Yemen was towards some sort of elections. Houthis knew they couldn't win, and because only Ahl al-Bayt are allowed to rule in Yemen according to the Houthis, they decided to embark on a coup, and Iran supported them in that coup and recognized them. They were the first country to recognize them after their coup. I think that Ismail Qa'ani, one of the most senior figures in Iran, his traveling to Iraq in the last couple of days to go and sort out the divisions amongst Iran's proxies in Iraq. They've been arguing over who should be the prime minister. I think it shows that Iran is trying to shore up its influence in Iraq and trying to maintain that position in Iraq itself. It's clear that the Iranians do still have this idea of how to preserve their proxy influence in the region that is primarily geared towards, or that has, let's put it nicely, that is primarily claimed the lives of far more Muslims than what Iran would otherwise like to claim. I think that the position a Muslim can take in this instance is not necessarily the unconditional support for the Iranians, but rather trying to find a stance that benefits the stability, security, and well-being of the region itself. And I always argue that position is a very simple one. Enjoin what is good and forbid what is evil. I think there is wisdom in saying to the Iranians that look what happens when you alienate everybody in pursuit of this policy. Maybe there should be a revision and a reflection by which you say that I need another approach to the region. Rather than seeking to conquer it, maybe I should try to live side by side with the neighbors. The same way that people are calling on the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and these others and saying to them that, look, you relied so much on the Americans and the Israelis, look, they didn't bring you any benefit. Now you need to know, you need to go back to the asl, to the roots, and you need to find some sort of new regional order, and you need to find some sort of security order by which you are able to assert agency and defend yourself. You can't rely on the Americans, you can't rely on the Israelis in order to provide that security. You have to find a way that is indigenous, and indigenous means some sort of more Muslim coordination as reflected in the pursuit. I'm not sure bin Salman is doing it for that reason, but in any case, as reflected in the talks ongoing between Turkiye, Egypt, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the idea of creating an own independent regional order. The same way that people are calling on a more independent regional order, independent security structure, I think that it's not about tactical alliance, it's about also doing the duty to the Iranian brothers and sisters and saying to them, this expansionist foreign policy that you've been pursuing and you still seem to want to continue pursuing, please Iran, can you set it aside? Can we finally come to an agreement whereby we live together in peace? Do you have to keep setting up proxies in the region? Do you have to keep your eyes in Syria, in which you try to create this bridge that goes all the way to Lebanon, and in the end the ones who suffer the most are the Muslims as opposed to those who you claim are suffering instead? That's not a tactical alliance. That's being somebody who's trying to look for the benefit of the community at large. And that's why I think you can do that while condemning the documented war crimes. You can say that they committed war crimes, but this is a chance to change the ways. You committed war crimes, but this is a chance to do things differently. You've shown that you can make a superpower come to you at the table. You've shown you can do that with limited power. Imagine what the power could be if you chose that instead of hegemony, that we can live side by side together. And that applies to both sides. I'm not saying this is only Iran here to be condemned or to be blamed, but also UAE, which is trying to entrench the Israelis and allowing them to set up a base in Somaliland to protect or to attack the Iranian attempts to shut the Bab al-Mandab via the Houthis. I think this is a legitimate position to take. I don't think a Muslim is bound to defend oppression where they see it. And I think that sometimes if we can recognize the crime, but also recognize the possibility for, this isn't for me to say, this is something for the victims to come up, but I think that certainly redemption is possible if there is a desire for redemption. The problem, I think, is that when you look at the disagreements between the Iranians themselves over the negotiations, how some of the Iranians want to negotiate with the Americans, while the others are concerned that those negotiations for sanctions relief and for the unfreezing of the billions of dollars might come at the expense of Iran's proxy machine. There are some, especially in the IRGC, who want to preserve that proxy machine. Why? Because when Saudi Arabia now is setting up Oxygen, the port on the Red Sea, in order to create land routes so it can bypass the Hormuz, Iran wants to have those Iraqi proxies where it can frustrate those attempts at land transit in order to preserve its leverage in the Hormuz Strait and ensure that it's not cut out from the trade routes in the region. Saudi wants to do Oxygen all the way to Duqm in Oman by land to avoid the Hormuz Strait to prevent Iran's ability from squeezing its economy. I think the reason Iran wants to keep Hezbollah in Lebanon and wants to keep its proxies in western Syria is because it wants, or in southern Syria as well, it's because it's concerned that if Turkiye, Jordan, Syria and Saudi Arabia create that pipeline, then effectively it kind of cuts Iran out, and it wants to use these proxies to frustrate such a pipeline, to demand that it is included in any discussion regarding the redrawing of the transport and supply chain routes in the region. And I think that's why Iran, one of the biggest decisions that it may find it has to make, which will be very difficult for the Iranians to make, is which takes precedent? Which takes precedence? Is it the requirement for money to build domestically to rebuild what's been devastated, or is it those proxies to ensure a more expansionist policy, either because they believe in the survival of a Persian Empire, or they believe that in order to be preemptively offensive is the best form of defense, given that they believe the region is trying to be redrawn in a way that isolates the Iranians. I think that the best approach for any Muslim to take is to say, Iran, you did wrong, just as people say that the Saudis did wrong, the UAE did wrong, and that maybe that because everybody did such wrongs, this is a situation where we find ourselves in. Israel becoming increasingly entrenched, war, killing, slaughter. Maybe it's time to consider a different way. There's a way in which the page can be turned. And I think that is how, you're not holding a tactical alliance, that's how you maintain the desire for goodness in the community and the desire for genuine peace, harmony that can be the foundation for something great and increasing autonomy in a world that seems to be collapsing in and of itself. On to Abdullah. Abdullah is a First Move subscriber. He subscribed to the First Move, and Abdullah, I want to thank you for subscribing. And I saw this question that you actually sent via the email, via the form on the website on movecollective.com. What would actually trigger a Turkish military confrontation with Israel? I think that the Israelis are not interested in attacking Turkey itself. I think what they want to do is to ruin Turkey in Syria. The Israelis want to take large swathes of Syria, and they're finding that Turkey is standing in its way. The Israelis believed that after Bashar al-Assad fell, that they would be able to use their leverage and influence in Washington to govern what comes next. What they were surprised about, and why Netanyahu kept visiting the United States over and over and over, almost 7-8 times in the past 2 years, is because Netanyahu became frustrated that Donald Trump is not only hearing from Netanyahu in one ear, but also Erdogan on the other. Erdogan, who's been telling Donald Trump that Ahmad al-Shara is not going to be problematic for you, that Ahmad al-Shara is not somebody who was going to lead to the disintegration of Syria, that if you support him, he can keep Syria intact, meaning you don't need to get involved directly, you don't need to spend your resources, you don't need to send your troops. Ahmad al-Shara can keep the peace. Erdogan has been saying to Donald Trump that look, after all that happened in Syria, this guy comes and takes Damascus, he issues pardons, he tries to keep all the sectarian groups, tries to bring harmonization in the community, limits revenge attacks and the like, that this is somebody who at least is willing to discuss and talk with the West to try to normalize the state of Syria in its relations with the Western world. Erdogan has been saying to Donald Trump, who's the only party who keeps causing you a headache in Syria after Assad has fallen? And the reality is, Erdogan's been saying, it's the Israelis. The Israelis want you to spend money. The Israelis want you to send troops. The Israelis want you to have war in Syria. Mr. President Erdogan says, we in Turkey are the guarantors of this peace. We'll make sure Ahmad al-Shara behaves. Don't you trust me? I stood with you when they rigged the election against you in 2020. I continue to be your friend. I hate Biden too, because Biden used to say that he would support the opposition against me in toppling me when he was running for election in 2020. Mr. Trump, you know I'm your friend. You know I'm your ally. You know I'm somebody that you can trust. Trump turns around and says, Erdogan is my friend. I like Erdogan. And therefore, Trump has been more inclined to go along with Turkey's project for Syria, which is to allow Ahmad al-Shara, which is to keep Syria united, which is to prevent the emergence of a Marxist separatist Kurdish state in the northeastern regions. And Trump trusts Erdogan so much that the last of the American troops left Syria last week, meaning there's no American presence anymore. The Israelis are deeply concerned at the level of influence that Erdogan has, not over Trump, but that Trump listens to Erdogan. And this is why I think the Israelis are desperately keen to ruin that relationship by painting Turkey as a threat to the Americans, as a threat to the Israelis, leveraging and lobbying for a confrontation between the US and the Turks. It's why there have been suggestions that maybe Turkey should be kicked out of NATO. It's why there are suggestions that Turkey is no longer in favor of US interest in the region. And that's why the US has also cultivated this relationship with Tom Barrack, the US ambassador to Turkey, who is a Zionist, who once said that why should Israel respect the borders of the region that were drawn up by the British and the French? Israel recognizes that these are tribes, suggesting Israel can go as far as it wants. Tom Barrack and the Turks have nurtured a relationship whereby Tom Barrack at least comes out openly and says to the Israelis, they need to stop provoking Turkey. That Erdogan is truly an ally. And this is very problematic for the Israelis, who are used to monopolizing that influence. They're used to monopolizing US influence over US foreign policy. And that's why I think that what would actually trigger a Turkish military confrontation with the Israelis, Gaddafi many years ago said that one day there will be a direct border between Israel and the Turks. And the Arabs will be irrelevant then. And now when you look at Syria, it's almost a de facto border between the Turks and between the Israelis. I'm not doing this to discredit the Syrians in any way whatsoever, but the reason Damascus is able to continue to enjoy its stability at this moment in time is partly to do with the Syrians, but also significantly to do with Turkey's extensive lobbying on Syria's behalf in Washington, and Turkey's extensive lobbying in Abu Dhabi and in Riyadh in order to get these two capitals not to antagonize or to conspire against the government in Damascus to bring it down in a way that they brought the government down in Egypt and the way that they brought the government down in Tunisia and these other places. What would it take to trigger a conflict? I think that the Israelis want to use the Druze in the south to provoke a conflict. But as Tom Barrack said at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, Ahmad al-Shara has not responded to those provocations. Ahmad al-Shara believes as long as he doesn't respond, then the Americans will not be forced to choose between the Israelis and the Syrians. As long as he doesn't respond to the Israelis and doesn't give the Israelis an excuse to go to the Americans and say, look, you see, now he's attacking us, then the Americans will continue to limit and restrict what Israel can do in Syria. And that is why the Israelis are going after Turkey. That's why the Israelis are trying and lobbying their media and pushing them to get rid of Erdogan, to say he is the enemy. Syria is the frustration between them. Theobaldo on X, I saw your question about has the war permanently damaged Dubai and Doha's neutral safe hub brand? And Muzammil followed up the question with, what would it actually take for Gulf states to break from US hegemony? Qatar and the UAE believe that this war has exposed very existential threats to their states. These are small states that can only survive with the support of a foreign power. What I mean is, the Qataris built their defense infrastructure on the Al Udeid base by the Americans. 1996, they bring in the Americans to point the base at Saudi Arabia to prevent any scenario by which Saudi Arabia can swallow up the Qataris, whether culturally or militarily or the like. The UAE likewise did the same. UAE using the British and the Americans in order to point towards the Saudis and say, we will not be swallowed up by the Saudis, they may be the big brother, and even leveraging the Americans to say to the Saudis, don't look at us as little brothers, otherwise we'll bring the American bullets and the American guns and we'll point them at you. And there is a notorious leak once of a recording where Hamdi bin Jasim, the former Qatari Prime Minister, discussed with the Americans the idea of splitting Saudi into 5 different states. He was saying that's what the Americans were planning, and that perhaps even, he didn't say this, but the suggestion was that Qatar, UAE and these other nations might support the carving out of Saudi Arabia, meaning I would rather carve Saudi into 5 different states than ever accept a scenario by which Saudi Arabia leads in the region. That's changing slightly in Hamdi bin Jasim's rhetoric, where he's come out and said that this war with Iran shows that we need a regional security order and Saudi should be the one to lead. The Qataris and the UAE are pursuing 2 very distinct approaches. The blockade in 2017 demonstrated to the Qataris that they could not entirely rely on the Americans. So they brought in the Turkish military base. When they brought in the Turkish military base, the popular narrative is that that Turkish military base at least prevented the scenario by which Saudi Arabia invades the Qataris. The problem, however, is that after the blockade, the Qataris had to choose between expanding the Turkish military base, which is what Erdogan wanted, and between restoring the pact with the US by saying to the Biden administration that, okay, it was Trump's fault, but you will protect us and you will look after Al Udeid. And the Qataris took extra precautions by giving money to Jared Kushner and his investment fund. In the event that Trump wins again, they won't be caught off guard again. They will be able to use and leverage that money. Didn't really work, but in any case, to leverage that money in order to secure that American protection if Trump comes back to power. The Qataris, UAE and Saudis are all invested in the Larry Ellison's Warner Brothers takeover in order to try to find some way in which they can keep at least some ties with the Israelis and with the Americans to ensure that protection. The point is, when the Qataris were asked to choose between the Turks and the Americans, they chose the Americans. Some of it had to do with the idea that there are some sensitivities that sometimes the Turks, they treat the Qataris like a cash cow. But in any case, they refused to expand the Turkish military base and they restored the idea of the Americans at the center. Now that the Americans have failed to protect them against the Iranians, Qatari media is in overdrive in pushing or entrenching the Iranian narrative in the hearts of millions of Muslims around the world. And we've seen the clips and the reports of very eloquent speaking Iranians coming out and asserting that Iran is the victim of all that is taking place. And even some clips saying that Iran has never harmed the Arab states, which is false. When you look at what Iran has done in the region to the other nations, it's categorically for Iran. There is a reason why many of the Arab states consider Iran a threat, and it's not just to do with competition for hegemony. It does have to do a lot with proxy Syria and things that the Iranians actually committed as opposed to the rhetoric being said. The Qataris are essentially saying to the Iranians that, look, we've leveraged our media in order to deliver your narrative to the hearts of millions of Muslims who are now on your side. Therefore, go easy on us in the aftermath. If war breaks out again, don't hit us. Go hit UAE and these, but don't hit us. That we, the Qataris, who are feeling this existential crisis, we're willing to, maintain those ties with you. Qatar is playing a balancing act between the Americans and between the Iranians, and that's being shown. The UAE are doing the other way. The UAE are saying that because the Americans haven't protected us, what we need to do is double down on our support for the Israelis. Let's get the Israelis. If the Israelis, as long as we maintain our ties with them, they can, and we entrench them in the region, the Israelis will always get the Americans to back us. We will influence America through the Israelis, which is why the UAE helped to facilitate the normalization between Somaliland and Israel. The idea being is the UAE are saying to the Israelis, come to Socotra in Yemen, come to Somaliland. I, the UAE, will give you, the Israelis, the ability to have a military presence on the Red Sea. I will give you a military presence on that particular strait, and in exchange, you ensure that I am able to access American support for what I want to do in Yemen or in Sudan or in Libya or in any of these other places as I go and fight these Islamist influences that threaten to topple my government. The UAE policy, whereas the Qataris are trying to cozy up to the Iranians, the UAE are cozying up to the Israelis and entrenching them in the region and giving them access to set up military bases in the region. The reason why I start with this is the UAE and the Qataris are aware that if they cannot find a way to navigate these superpowers, they'll be swallowed in the infighting between them. That's the nature of how these smaller Gulf states have to operate. And that's why I think that the image of them as a neutral safety hub or safe hub has been damaged significantly, but they are trying to recalibrate themselves as indispensable to bigger powers that want to achieve their aims in the region. Qatar is saying to the Iranians that, look, I'm not exactly on them, I can help to facilitate the soft power that you want to spread into the region, just please don't hit me. And the UAE is saying to the Israelis, don't let me lose, don't let me get swallowed up by Saudis, don't let me get hit by the Iranians, and I promise to entrench you in a way where you cannot be kicked out again. I'll give you that base in Somaliland. Disaster. In any case, does it actually matter economically? I think it does matter economically. I think that the countries are deeply reliant on LNG and oil exports and the like, but it remains to be seen how these new supply chain structures will follow up. Muzammil's question when he says, what would it actually take for Gulf states to break from US hegemony? When the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ died, he didn't appoint a successor. And as he didn't appoint a successor, there are reports that before, as he was dying, Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala an, was asked or was told by one of his relatives, go to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and ask him who will be the leader. And some reports, and this is even in Shia reports, Ali ibn Abi Talib turns around and says, La wallahi, I will not ask the Prophet ﷺ. And when he was asked why, he said, because if I ask him and he says a name other than me, then the people will never follow me. They'll take it as a prophetic injunction that Ali ibn Abi Talib should never be Khalifa. Radiallahu ta'ala an. The Prophet ﷺ dies and doesn't appoint a successor. Everybody's in a bit of a hysteria, and then Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu stands up and he says, whoever worshipped Muhammad, let him know Muhammad is dead. And whoever worshipped Allah, let him know that Allah is alive and Allah will never die. Then the issue came about, how do we handle who should be the next leader? So Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala an, as the relative of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they appoint him and they say to him, you take care of the funeral burial. We've heard that Ansar are gathering the people of Medina to appoint an emir. We're going to go to them so we can be part of those discussions. You handle the funeral rites so that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not left unburied. Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala an goes for the funeral rites, and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu and Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu and the other Sahaba, they arrive and they are with the Ansar. The Ansar, they turn around and they say to the Sahaba, to the Muhajirin, they are Sahaba, the Ansar. They say to the Muhajirin, they say to the Makkah, that given we need to choose a leader, let's choose a leader from us and a leader from you. An emir from us and an emir from you, and these two will rule together. Umar al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala responds and he says that this is not a good method of governing, having two leaders. And if we should choose, then it is better that we choose somebody from Quraysh. The reasoning was that Umar al-Khattab said that the other tribes of Arabia that might be unruly, they might accept following somebody from Quraysh, but they may not accept following somebody from Aus and Khazraj. An awareness of the geopolitical situation at the time and adapting accordingly in order to choose a ruler. And then from the Ansar and the Muhajirin, they decide together, we'll appoint Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu. He's from the Quraysh, which means the rest of the tribes are more likely to follow him. We, the Ansar, love him because he's the best friend of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Umar al-Khattab says, Wallahi, I would gladly follow Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. I would never dare rule over him. And Abu Bakr as-Siddiq becomes that leader. In the Gulf states, the Arab states, everybody wants to be emir. But emir, they want to rule together. When Al-Mansur, one of the most legendary generals in Andalusia, who was the de facto ruler of Andalusia, when he died, he divided power between his two sons. He made his two sons the de facto ruler. And according to historical reports, one ends up getting assassinated under dubious circumstances, Sancello and these others, and then it starts and that from the appointment of these two, a civil war takes place in which Andalusia goes from being one united kingdom to 32 taifas. Harun al-Rashid, who ruled over Baghdad in the Golden Age era, when he dies, decides to split the power again between two sons, to let them rule together. They end up clashing with one another, and it leads to the decline of the empire together. The problem in the Gulf states when you talk about reduction of US hegemony is, the Gulf states have two choices. Either they unite behind the common leader, and this could take many forms. I remember one of my, somebody who has significant influence over my own thinking and thoughts is He's a lecturer actually in a university in Ankara in law. His name is Dr. Emir Kaya. He was my tutor at university, and then we became very close friends later. Emir Kaya once gave a theory. We were sitting once upon a time in Turkiye, and he said to me, he was thinking of doing a paper on establishing a rotating caliphate. And I said, what do you mean a rotating caliphate? And he said, the idea that you establish like an EU-esque government where you have the individual states, but you have like an EU commission or EU government, and you have a rotating caliphate. So every year, like 1 year it's Saudi, 1 year it's Turkey, 1 year it's, each time a country is taking the presidency of that. So you have like a supranational institution that is primarily focused first and foremost with free movement, free trade and the like, until you normalize the idea of free trade and free movement, and then maybe possibly it will take on a life of its own, and that will help to unite the Ummah once more. In other words, taking the OIC to the next level. I thought this was a fascinating idea. But in any case, the Gulf states, and in the Muslim states, the Gulf states in particular, the only two choices in reality, geopolitically and pragmatically, are these. Either one emir from us, one emir from you. That Umar al-Khattab said will never work, that it is a disastrous idea. Or they agree to follow one leader, even if it is in a rotating caliphate, as Emir Kaya once suggested. The Gulf leaders prefer that not only will I not follow one leader, but if any of you, my brothers, try to be the leader, wallahi, I'll bring the American bullets against you. If any of you try it, any of you, try to be the leader. If any of you try to sit slightly higher, if any of you, if the world says that you are the leader, wallahi alladhi la ilaha illahu, I'll bring the American military bases and the Israelis against you. Don't even try it. I would rather rule over my small kingdom than ever entertain the possibility of being part of something bigger. Everyone assumes that the issue is it's foreign influence coming in and they are causing the divisions. But a colonizer cannot come in without a collaborator. Colonizer cannot come in without an environment that allows it. Not all of them may be collaborators. Some of them may be seeking protection from another brother, bringing an outsider. Some people like to convert to do the tafsir of the ayah. إلا أن تتقوا منهم تقى لا يتخذ المؤمنون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين ومن يفعل ذلك فليس من الله في شيء إلا أن تتقوا منهم تقى ويحذركم الله نفسه. You ask what's the biggest obstacle? It's not energy, it's not dependency, it's not security guarantees, it's not dollar reserves, it's not succession politics. It's, I want to be king. And if I cannot get the authority or mandate from my people, as in the case of Pakistan or these others, I'll get it through an international mandate. If I can't get it through the elections, I'll get it through Trump and negotiate peace with the Iranians. And that's why sometimes people say you're not as harsh on Western governments as you are on Muslim governments. That's not the case at all. It's rather, if I was to say to you honestly, is America doing anything unusual in its support for the Israelis? Is America doing anything unusual in its support in this war against the Iranians? Are they doing anything strange based on what you've read in their history? No. Who's doing the strange thing? The Muslims who have a way of life that tells them what is better, but they choose that which is not better. I don't know how to pronounce these usernames, Ibn Fis and Hamza, but this last section is inspired by your questions. One talked about why do we not talk about the countries of West Africa and their realignment away from France and the like. And Hamza talks about how do we apply all of these at the community level, everything that we've been discussing at the community level. I actually think that one of the reasons why I enjoy telling the stories of Bosnia is not because they are the only stories that I know, but it's because for many who are living in the West at least, it's an easy place to visit and it's an easy place through which to dispel what you think your perception is of the Ummah. What I mean is when we think of Ummah, when we think of Muslims, we think of the Arabian deserts. We think of the Desis in the Indian subcontinent. We think of the Malaysians and the Indonesians. But what about the idea that Islam is ethnically European as well? that it is indigenous to Europe and has been in Europe for hundreds of years, in Spain for almost 800 years, in Bosnia for all these. When you go there and you see it, the reaction is often is, these are not just revert Muslims, these are inherent Muslims, European Muslims, ethnically European Muslims, Slavic Muslims who continue to hold on to their faith. And even when abandoned by all to genocide, they still hold on to their faith because their belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was not brought about by the sword, but brought about through a genuine conviction of the heart. It shocks people when they go for 2, 3, 4 days to Bosnia and they say, oh, I never thought Islam could look like this, where you have a majority European country, or it is overwhelmingly majority European country. It is all European country. It's the almost entire population is European, but these Europeans are the ones building the minarets. They are the ones learning the Quran. They are the ones spreading the Islam. They are the ones who are building the war masjid on Igman Mountain. They are the ones who are preserving the awqaf and rebuilding awqaf and entrenching these systems that allow Islam to continue surviving. It does something to the way in which we perceive the Ummah and the way in which we understand the Ummah and the bonds and the connections that tie us to the various different ummah. And this is why when we talk about West Africa, it's not necessarily that West Africa has been forgotten, but rather the means of communication and lines of communication whereby we pass down the stories of West Africa in a way that people pass down the stories of Arabia and other places. The reality is that it's lacking in many of these Muslim circles. And I'll explain what I mean. Two figures that I enjoy reading about is Muhammad Traore, or otherwise known as Aski of the Songhai, and Sunjata Keita. Sunjata Keita has an extraordinary story. Born from their second wife, lame in one leg, exiled after his father dies by the first wife, according to legend, but manages to unite the tribes on Islam and founds the Caliphate of Mali, of which his great nephew would later be the ruler, the great nephew that you all know, who is Mansa Musa. Sunjata Keita is an extraordinary individual. Aski of the Songhai, likewise, Muhammad Traore lived in a time similar to, close period to Ahmed al-Mansur. Ahmed al-Mansur, more well known in Morocco for the victory that he achieved over Castilla when they came into Morocco to try to invade Morocco. The reason I know of Aski of the Songhai is not because it was taught to me by any Islamic literature. It was because there was a video game I played as a teenager called Civilization, Sid Meier's Civilization. And in one of the editions, they added this Aski of the Songhai. And I noticed that one of the key units that they can build is a mud mosque. And I said, mud mosque? Who is this Aski of the Songhai? And why are there references to Islam here? And they have this sort of, brief history. And that leads you to reading. And then you end up going down, not a rabbit hole, but you go down this amazing universe that you'd been disconnected to for most of your life. An extraordinary universe of grandeur, of literature, of Islam, of Quran, of Hadith, of scholars, of science, of development, of Hajj, of pure beauty that I've been disconnected to for most of my life. I won't say that it is necessarily the fault of those who didn't tell the story. It could be my fault for not exploring it. I spent Ramadan in Ghana in 2008. And it wasn't like Ghanaians had an inferiority complex to the Arabs. This was proud Ghanaian Muslims who knew their heritage and history, and they celebrated it, and they would do the takbirat on Eid. I was there for Eid al-Fitr. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. And it completely changes and reorients your perspective, because the question you ask yourself is not when did Islam come here, but why did it take me so long to come to Islam here? It's how do you tell these stories and how do you link these stories? And that's why I think one of the greatest tragedies of colonization was not the physical colonization. One of the greatest, although that was one of the greatest tragedies, perhaps one of the greatest tragedies also was the disintegration of the bridges of memories by which a Muslim, when you read Ibn Kathir or Ibn Khaldun or the like, they are talking about the Ummah from Morocco all the way to Indonesia like it's normal. It's normal for a Muslim to inherit all these memories of Muslims who came before of Baba Ahmed, but we don't inherit those memories. Where did those memories go, and why am I unable to access them? And that's why you understand later on why the Israelis are so keen to remove Palestine from the museums, so that it disappears from the books, so that the future generations don't have that connection to Palestine anymore, because they don't come across it so often. They don't come across it so easily, and therefore no one comes across Palestine in their youth. They come about it later in life when it is almost too late to even do anything. It's why there's so much focus on education curriculums. What stories are you teaching? What movies are you showing? I saw a joke about The Lion King where they said, if you notice, and I loved The Lion King growing up. I didn't notice this growing up until He said that if you notice, all the great characters, Simba, Mufasa and the like, they all speak in an American accent. The villain speaks in an English accent. And the monkey speaks in an African accent. And the whole series is the whole movie is supposed to be set in Africa. The good guy's American accent. Your process to believe the good guy will always be American. The villain in the English accent. I'm married into the English, my in-laws are English. I don't know how they feel about the Americans always casting the villain in English accent. And the monkey, the African, speaks in African accent, speaks English language, African accent, and it's all set within Africa itself. It's a subconscious push to establish a lens through which you view the world. It's like that Trevor Noah sketch when he came out and said villains, one with a Russian accent, scary, but in an Indian accent, you end up laughing. I'm not affirming it, I'm saying ask yourselves why. What is it in that social conditioning that meant that these stories of West Africa and that have been completely absent in the traditional training of a Muslim today in the way that they view the world? And I'll finish on this point. Think about it. The Ertugrul series was built out of a coin that said Ertugrul Ghazi. We don't know much about Ertugrul, but a 5-season series meant that people started going to every city mentioned in the series. Souat, which had no tourism, after 2019 is loaded with tourism because of that story. Konya 2019 had some tourism, now it's overflowing with tourism because people coming from Pakistan because they want to see the capital of Alauddin Kaykubat. It shows you that the revival of these stories does resonate with people and it does lead to economic and political change by which new direct flight routes are made and people end up going to visit more and the like. And this is why I argue that we won't play the blame game here as to why it's there or why what happens or the like. But the reality is that there is a beautiful, when you see these stories of the Ummah, you begin to view the Ummah differently, which is why these bridges had to be broken by a colonizer. That when you have these references, you view the Ummah differently, which is why these bridges had to be broken by the colonizer. Why the French tried to wipe out the Arabic language in Algeria. Why they wanted to remove the hijab. Why they wanted to destroy the identity. Because the power of the identity is that it transcends those borders. And perhaps the best answer to your question is, get on a plane. Go to Accra. Go to Dakar. Go to Abuja. My dream has always been to go to Sokoto. I haven't had the chance to go there. I went to Abuja once and I didn't have the chance to go up the road to Sokoto. But I'd love to go. It was the capital of Askia. It was the capital of Muhammad Traore. There is still an emirate there, Emir of Kano there as well. And there is still a library over there that is centuries old. A library there that has been preserved by the Hausa people there in the north. So, when you see these stories, you realize that Allah will always keep it alive. It's not Muslims that make Islam great. It's Islam that makes the Muslims great. That nations can come and go, but Islam stays. Nations can rise and fall, but Islam stays because Allah is the one who protects it. And the greatest honor Allah can give any one of us is to use us for a particular purpose, as He used those in West Africa, as He used those in Indonesia and Malaysia and these others, in that even if the Arabs perhaps are trying to de-Islamize, such as King Saud University removing the Arabic language from its courses, Arabic is still thriving in Malaysia, it's thriving in West Africa. People are preserving the traditions, they're preserving their cultures, and not doing it in a way in which they are assimilating, but doing it in a way in which they are integrating, where they have the beauty of their culture, they have the beauty of their indigenous languages, but the love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means that it is consistently preserved. And even if perhaps there is a de-Islamization in lands that used to be completely Islamized, certainly you will find that it is being revived elsewhere. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always keep His deen alive. I think that's it for this episode. I want to thank those who decided the topics for this particular show, those of you who posed the questions, whether it's Hamza, Theobolda, Kandashian, again you might want to change your username, Faisal Abad, Abdullah from the first move, from the subscriber from the first move, and if you haven't subscribed, do subscribe as well. And put your questions for next episode underneath this video as well. I will do another shout out, call out as well later on in the week, asking you for your questions as to what it is that you want to understand. What do you want to know more of? Put the questions in. This is the whole point of the show, is how do we move together? How can we mobilize? How can we apply it in our day to day? Perhaps the one we can take away from today's episode is not to go play Civilization. Don't spend too much time on your video games. But go and read about particularly Askia of the Songhai. Go read about Sunjata Keita. Read about these two in particular and see where it leads you. See how it leads you back to the history of Andalusia that you already know about. So you see the link and you see the influence they had on Andalusia. See how it takes you to Egypt that you already know a lot about but didn't realize the influence of those West African kingdoms on Egypt and on Saudi Arabia and on the Arabian Peninsula. Read it and see where it takes you. All you need is 2-3 days of reading about it and see where it takes you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.